In the winter of 2012, a young man vanished in the frozen wilderness of Vermont. It all started as just a simple hike, but somewhere along the way, things went terribly wrong. At first, it just seemed like your typical missing hiker case, right? But I promise you that this story is unlike anything you've ever heard before. And I say that because what they found in those woods wasn't just heartbreaking. It was so shocking that it literally forced an entire state to change its laws immediately. This story has never been told on YouTube before, at least as far as I'm aware. And by the time that you hear the end of it, you're not just gonna be shocked, you're gonna be straight up pissed off. Now, if you couldn't tell from my shirt right here, well, I'm from Vermont. I don't live there anymore, but I did back in June of 2020. And it was right around then that I went for a hike on the Coulee Glen Emily Proctor Loop, which lies within Green Mountain National Forest. This hike is about 13 miles, and while I was on it, I had no idea that roughly 8 years prior, that very same trail that I was on was the setting of one of the most frustrating cases in all of National Forest history. So with that said, let's take a virtual trip right now to my home state, Vermont. Now I'm inviting you on this trip for free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you are a repeat viewer. And if you're already subscribed, number one, thank you. And number two, you can cover your admission for this video by either hitting the like button or by dropping a comment down below and telling me where in the world you're from. In January of 2012, 19-year-old Levi Duclos decided to go for a last-minute solo hike on the Emily Proctor Trail in Green Mountain National Forest. Well, I say that, but I guess technically it was a solo hike, but maybe technically it wasn't. And I say that because Levi did bring the family dog, which was named Duke, along with him. So I don't know. He was the only person anyways. So just like yours truly, Levi grew up right at the front door of Green Mountain National Forest. But after graduating high school, he decided to explore some different scenery. He actually went and spent a few months in Nepal over the summer, and then he headed to Portland, Oregon to start his freshman year of college at Reed College. After his first semester at Reed, Levi went back to Vermont for winter break, excited about his new experiences and his new friendships that he made at school. I'm sure those of you that went to college can understand this. You do this semester, then you come back and you're just full of opportunities and possibilities. And so this winter break offered him a chance to kind of just pause after all that stuff and just reconnect with his roots and his hometown. And in an effort to do this, Levi decided to go for a hike. At 12:30 p.m. on January 9th, 2012, he leashed up Duke and he began to lead him up the Emily Proctor Trail. And again, speaking as someone who has hiked this very same trail before, it's not an easy hike per se, but it's definitely not extreme either. In fact, for Vermont standards, this is my opinion, I would say that it's pretty tame, and for Levi, this hike really shouldn't have been much of a problem. You see, it's really important for you to know that Levi was an athlete. He was fit, he had a pretty good amount of hiking experience, maybe not on this particular trail, but on plenty of similar trails in the area around his hometown. The temperatures were a little bit unseasonably warm, you could say, on January 9th, 2012. And before Levi set out, he told his younger brother a vague overview of what his plans were going to be. And so those two factors combined with Levi's level of fitness should have made his hike a safe, if uneventful, ordeal. And that's why when Levi's mother, Anne, returned home from work around 6 p.m., she was shocked to find that Levi hadn't returned home from his hike. Anne immediately had this gut feeling that something was wrong, and unfortunately, that gut feeling was deadly accurate. Things are obviously about to get pretty disturbing, folks. And so before we get there, I do just want to lighten up the mood a bit, kind of take a chill pill, relax, and tell you about Drink Element. So we're talking about winter hiking here. That's not really something I do a lot of. I do it mostly in the summer, but in the winter, I do ski a lot, if you couldn't tell from my goggle tan here. When I'm skiing, I sweat. I'm going through the trees. I'm doing all this crazy stuff. I'm super good. Trust me, dude. That's sarcasm. But I sweat a lot. And I found that if I don't replace my electrolytes, I get like muscle cramps, I get fatigued, and my day on the mountain is basically ruined. And this is where Drink Element comes in. Element is the best way to replace your electrolytes, whether you're skiing or hiking or doing anything at all that makes you sweat. They don't have any sugar. They don't have any crap like so many of the other electrolyte drink mix companies. I mean, you know, you've seen them before, right? None of that nonsense. All Element has is a great taste. Speaking of that great taste, you're actually going to be in luck when it comes to this, because if you go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking, that's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, and you make an order of whatever flavor sounds best to you. I would recommend citrus salt. That's kind of my favorite. When you make that order through my link, you're going to get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost, so you can try everything they have to offer. And believe me, you want to, because they have some crazy awesome flavors. So one more time, go to drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, make a purchase through there, get your sample pack thrown in with the order, or click that link right at the top of the description. And now let's get back to the story. So on January 9th, 2012, Levi's mother, Anne, arrived home from work right around 6 p.m., and she was very alarmed that Levi clearly had not returned from his hike. And so she quickly began kind of analyzing his stated plans in her head, desperately searching for any excuse as to why Levi was still out there, why he wasn't home yet. Levi had stated that he was going to be hiking the Emily Proctor Trail. However, he didn't really make clear what his actual destination was. There's no mountain peak at the end of the Emily Proctor Trail. It basically just connects with the long trail. There's a shelter there as well. And so Anne wasn't really sure if Levi had just kind of hiked up the Emily Proctor Trail and then turned around, or if he was planning on completing the much more ambitious Cooley Glen Emily Proctor loop hike. In addition to that confusion, Anne also wasn't sure what gear, clothing, or food and water that Levi had taken with him. She had no idea if Levi was equipped to spend a cold winter night outside, and frankly, Anne didn't really plan on waiting around to find this out. And so Anne called her sister-in-law, who is named Kathy, and the two of them came to a very sobering conclusion. By this point, it's now 8 p.m. Levi is still nowhere to be found, and though it had been warm earlier in the day, the temperature outside was now dropping very, very fast. It's important to note that even if it's warm down in town, down in the valley, up in the mountain, the temperatures can still be deadly cold. In a last-ditch effort of hope, Anne enlisted the help of a friend who actually lived very close to the Emily Proctor trailhead. This friend drove the short distance over to where the trail starts to see if Levi's car was still parked there. Because if it wasn't, then maybe he was okay and he was just on his way home or something like that. When Anne learned that Levi's car was in fact still parked at that trailhead, she now knew without a shadow of a doubt that her son was still up on that mountain somewhere. This was the final straw for Anne, and it's what pushed her to do the thing that every parent dreads the most. She picked up her phone, she dialed 911, and she reported her son missing. Now, the state of Vermont handles search and rescue missions a lot differently than most states. So instead of these missions being taken up by like state game wardens or local fire departments or volunteer search and rescue organizations, these missions are instead spearheaded by the Vermont State Police. And so recognizing the urgency of an overdue hiker potentially stranded in freezing conditions, as soon as the state police got the call, they immediately dispatched to the Emily Proctor trailhead. They also immediately informed the local fire department in the town of Ripton, and they called out for any assistance that they could get from other local volunteer search and rescue groups. And thanks to these efforts, within an hour and a half of Anne's initial 911 call, there were 2 search teams ready at the trailhead. One search team was going to hike up the Emily Proctor Trail, which was Levi's known direction of travel, and the other team was going to hike up the Cooley Glen Trail in case Levi had actually decided to complete that 13-mile loop. Because the state police understood the urgency of the situation, and because they immediately formulated an effective plan, they gave Levi, who was likely stranded or injured but still alive, the highest probability of survival. The only problem, however, was that everything I just told you about the state police's response was complete fiction. I made it up. Now, I'm sorry for lying to you folks, but the reason that I just made up all of that stuff about the police's response is because that basically would have been the best case scenario, and I want you to contrast it with what actually happened after Levi Duclos was reported missing. And once again, just be warned, I think by the end of this video, you're probably going to be pretty pissed off because the way that the Vermont State Police handled the search for Levi was incompetent at best and extremely negligent at worst. So let's go into the actual story of what happened. So Anne calls 911, and right after she did this, she formed a makeshift search party of her own, which consisted of her sister-in-law Kathy and 3 others, people that were both friends and family. By the time that they all arrived at the Emily Proctor Trailhead, it was just before 10 p.m. You know, this is about an hour and a half after Anne had called 911, and yet when they arrived, there were no searchers or no police officers, literally 0 people on scene at the trailhead yet. But that was about to change. So right as the group of 4 was about to actually begin their search, a lone state trooper pulled into the dark, cold parking lot. Anne and Kathy hoped that this meant the official search, you know, the ones by the professionals, not just the family thrown together. They hoped that this meant the official search was about to be launched, or at the very least that this officer would maybe join them in their last-minute search. After all, time was of the essence here. It was cold, Levi could easily freeze to death, and the quicker that boots were on the ground searching for him, the higher the chances of his survival. However, despite all of that, and much to Anne and Kathy's surprise, the only thing that this state trooper did was give them a warning. Well, actually, he gave them 2 warnings. First, he informed them that another officer would be coming by shortly to kind of inspect the scene, whatever that means. And secondly, he warned them not to search for Levi. He said it was safer and wiser to leave that to the experts, which is reasonable. It's understandable at the very least. But after giving these warnings, the state trooper drove away. He left, leaving Anne, Kathy, and the rest of the group completely perplexed at what to do. I mean, they were told not to search themselves, but they weren't given any information about when the official search would actually be started. Anne's son was somewhere potentially dying on the mountain at that very moment. And they had 4 people at the trailhead ready to search, and yet they were told to just wait? Like, wait for what? It obviously didn't make any sense. And so the group ignored the officer's directions. Kathy stayed at the trailhead in case Levi emerged or other officers and searchers arrived, and the rest of the group decided to go up the Cooley Glen Trail. Again, hoping that if Levi had decided to do that loop, they would be, hiking the loop in the opposite direction, and they would have a higher chance of kind of intercepting him along the way. The group hiked a few miles into the dark Vermont wilderness, but eventually they came to the crushing realization that they had chosen the wrong trail. By the time that they reached the intersection with the long trail, there were 0 footprints in the snow, meaning that it would have been impossible for Levi to have been there. And the thing you have to understand is that when they were deciding on which trail to search, they basically had to make a 50-50 decision. And tragically, and through no fault of their own, of course, they simply chose the wrong trail. At 12:30 a.m., now on January 10th, another state trooper arrived at the Emily Proctor trailhead and began to speak with Kathy. 4 critical hours had now passed since Anne's initial 911 call, and I'm sure that Kathy felt some relief when this officer arrived, some relief that help had finally gotten there. But, of course, this hope was quickly crushed when Kathy realized that this trooper's main focus was not to go actually find Levi, but rather to get her to fill out a missing persons form and kind of just start with that. So while this was happening, Anne and the rest of her group returned to the parking lot, and they reported that Levi had not been located on the Coulee Glen Trail, which therefore meant he must be stranded somewhere on the Emily Proctor Trail. That's what all logic and reason pointed to, and you would think that when confronted with this information, the state troopers would have immediately began hiking up the Emily Proctor Trail. Or at the very least, they would have called in the local Ripton Fire Department, who always had search and rescue volunteers on standby. You'd think that they would get somebody up that mountain immediately, but they didn't. It quickly became clear to Anne that the state troopers had zero intention of doing any of those things. And so with this realization, Anne decided that she had no choice but to take matters into her own hands. And so she resolved to hike up the Emily Proctor Trail herself. And in one of the most astonishing twists in this story so far, the state troopers told Anne that if she tried to continue searching for her own son, they were going to be placing her in handcuffs and taking her to jail. At this point, it was almost 1 a.m. Levi hadn't been seen since he started his hike at 12:30 p.m. the previous day, and an official search still had not yet been authorized. The troopers were kind of at the trailhead just messing around, doing bureaucratic stuff, filling out forms, stuff like that. There was no official search declared, but that did soon change. The police finally declared an official search, and they then immediately informed Kathy and Anne that the state police do not conduct searches at night. This meant that the search wouldn't start until the following morning, with the troopers beginning their shift at 6 in the morning. And so, completely defeated and facing arrest, Anne, Kathy, and the rest of their group were basically left with no choice but to just return home. As the temperature continued to drop, Levi was still up on the mountain somewhere. And, by the way, just to add insult to injury, one of the state troopers had filled out a search urgency form and marked that there was no hazardous weather predicted, which is insane. It's the winter, it's night, you're in the mountains, it's freezing cold. And tragically, and obviously, the very next morning, everyone would learn that that search urgency form was the understatement of the century. It's still unclear to me why the Vermont State Police refused to search for Levi in the darkness. I guess that they would probably cite safety as the reason, and assuming that's true, you would think that they would have, at the very least, started the search as soon as it was light enough to see without a headlamp, right? Like, why would you waste any time? But of course, that's not what happened here. In fact, the 3 state troopers and the 1 search dog that would be tasked with going to find Levi didn't even arrive at the Emily Proctor trailhead until 8 in the morning. By this point, it had been almost 12 hours since Anne's 911 call, and the official search was only now just getting started. This group of state troopers did eventually start climbing up the Emily Proctor Trail, and for the first few miles, things seemed pretty normal. They slowly made their way up the icy and snow-covered path until a very horrifying sight stopped them in their tracks. It was now 12 p.m., almost 24 hours since Levi had first started his hike. And so their discovery started with the dogs. So again, these troopers had a canine with them, and their dog kind of noticed something up ahead. He was kind of alerting, but At first, the officers couldn't really tell what was going on. But then, the Duclos' family dog, Duke, came wandering down the trail, and at this point, the troopers knew that they were closing in on something. And so they continued hiking for just a short distance further when, all of a sudden, this group of Vermont state troopers came upon the deceased body of Levi Duclos. He was located less than 3 miles from where his vehicle was parked down in the trailhead. Less than 3 miles from the very same trailhead that Anne and the rest of her group had been at the night before. And chillingly, on Levi's head was a headlamp that was still lit up from his struggle to survive, his hike back down from the night before. And so, after confirming that Levi was no longer alive, the troopers kind of secured the scene and they built a fire. They did their best to rescue Duke, trying to keep him close to the fire, trying to keep him warm. And then they turned their priorities from a rescue mission into an investigation. It wasn't immediately clear how or why Levi died. And so one of the state troopers continued up the trail, kind of following Levi's tracks to try and get some more answers. Levi's tracks continued all the way to the Emily Proctor shelter, at which point they turned and followed the long trail north. This indicates that Levi may have been attempting to hike that Cooley Glen Emily Proctor loop after all, but at some point he had decided to turn around. Levi's backpack was found along the long trail, but that didn't really yield any additional evidence. Though the tracks did continue on, the state trooper eventually decided to kind of call it and to turn around so that he could make it back down before daylight ended. Once again, it's brutally cold on the spine of the Green Mountains. And I can only imagine that as all of those troopers fought off the cold during their investigation and the body recovery, the importance of a swift search surely must have set in. I mean, I really wonder if they realized in those moments that they had blown it. But then again, I don't know exactly what they were thinking, but I do know, however, what the public was thinking when they learned the story of Levi Duclos. And folks, it really was not pretty. There was some initial confusion about Levi's cause of death, because at first the state police reported that he had broken his leg and then he'd tried to drag himself down the trail before eventually dying. But at some point the police actually redacted this statement and said that Levi had not actually broken his leg. And so the exact details that led up to his death are still a bit unclear to this day. But the cause of death is the exception to that. The cause of death was crystal clear, and it was hypothermia. Hypothermia is a dangerous condition that occurs when the body loses heat faster than it can produce it, which leads to confusion, shivering, a slowed heart rate, and of course death if not treated quickly. Levi was probably rushing back to his car, kind of trying to make it back before darkness set in, and he ended up injuring himself to the point where he couldn't walk anymore. We don't know what the injury was, but he probably tried to slide down the trail as far as he could, and eventually he just couldn't go any further, and hypothermia set in. Now, I've obviously placed a lot of blame on the police in this story, and I'm going to be coming back to them in just a second here. But right now, I do want to make one very important thing clear, which is that Levi made some very poor choices in his clothing and his gear on this hike, to the point where it very well likely cost him his life. And I don't say that to blame him or to shame him. We all make mistakes, but Levi was found wearing cotton clothing, which is a very big no-no when it comes to winter hiking. I'm sure some of you know this, but in case you don't, cotton absorbs moisture, it dries really slowly, and it doesn't insulate when it gets wet, which increases the risk of hypothermia for any hiker who is wearing it. And in addition to that, Levi was very clearly not planning on being in the woods for very long, because he had no backup clothing to change into. He didn't have an emergency blanket or any other gear that could have kept him warmer for longer. And again, I'm in no way trying to disparage Levi. I myself have made all of those same clothing mistakes on winter hikes before. I literally summited Vermont's highest mountain in the winter while I was wearing cotton clothing back in high school. I was just lucky, and I lived to tell the tale. I just think it's important to mention Levi's clothing and his gear choices because it is a massive takeaway, a lesson, if you will, from this case, and I hope that by mentioning it, at least one of you will be safer next time that you're on trail. He definitely made some bad choices with his gear and his clothing, and those certainly played a very, very big role in this story. But I have to say that despite those choices, there's still a very, very high chance that Levi would have survived if the Vermont State Police had acted even halfway competently after receiving Ann's 911 call. And thanks to media coverage of this case, including many pieces by a writer named Cindy Hill, the Vermont public and Vermont lawmakers were pissed about what happened. Levi's uncle was quoted saying, "I must reiterate that the Vermont State Police definitely blew it in the case of my nephew Levi." Now, I am far from an expert on hypothermia, but my understanding is that it takes some time to set in, right? It's not like an immediate thing that happens. There's no way for us to know exactly what time Levi died, but it is very likely that if a search had been conducted on the night of January 9th, shortly after Levi had been reported missing, he would have been found probably injured and very cold, but alive. There were multiple local and volunteer rescue teams that the Vermont State Police could have called in to help launch a quick search. In fact, the Emily Proctor Trail is located in the town of Ripton, Vermont, and the Ripton Fire Department has training in search and rescue. I mean, they live there. They're intimately familiar with all of the trails that are in their forests, and their fire captain would even go on the record saying that if they had been contacted that night, they would have put boots on the ground to search for Levi immediately. And what's even more frustrating to me is that this would not have been a complicated search. Levi was reported missing very quickly. His car was found at the trailhead. Everyone knew which trail he had taken. It's not like there was a massive search area and Levi could have been lost anywhere and it would have taken, days or weeks to find him. All it would have taken was like 2 or 3 volunteers to hike less than 3 miles up the Emily Proctor Trail by headlamp, and Levi most likely would have been found alive. But the Vermont State Police never notified any local search and rescue groups about Levi's disappearance. And in an incredibly frustrating twist of events, when a few of those local volunteer groups were eventually notified, it was the next day, and it was only so that they could come help remove Levi's body from the woods. Levi's death opened up a massive statewide discussion about search and rescue. Once again, Vermont handles their search and rescue way different than most other states. Many people, including Levi Duclos, called on the Vermont state legislature to strip the Vermont State Police of its power to handle search and rescue altogether. There were a lot of investigations which revealed that many local search and rescue groups that were trained and eager to help rescue lost hikers in Vermont had been rebuffed by the state police or just simply never utilized. I even found that at least one of these groups would just end up calling it quits and disbanding altogether. After over a year of press coverage, study committees, and debate between Vermont lawmakers, Governor Peter Shumlin signed a law that completely overhauled search and rescue procedures in the state. Though Vermont State Police did ultimately remain in charge of search and rescue, this legislation mandated quick response times and coordination with local search and rescue groups, which, again, were the 2 biggest shortcomings in Levi Duclos' case. I want to make it clear that I'm not telling you this story just so I can rip on the police or whatever. There's plenty of that in today's society, and I'm not trying to add to that noise. But I do think that you can be the most back the blue kind of person out there and still acknowledge that the way the Vermont State Police handled Levi's case was a complete and utter disaster. Now, this story took place over 13 years ago, and as far as I can tell, confidence in Vermont's search and rescue practices has been largely restored. Vermont State Police were very open to hearing criticism about their failures, and they were very cooperative in changing their practices. And so you got to give them credit for that, but unfortunately, as good as that is, it can't bring back Levi Duclos. Levi's mother, Anne, would express regret about calling 911 on the evening of January 9th, 2012, because if she had called the local fire department instead, it's very possible that Levi would still be alive today. May he rest in peace, and my heart goes out to him, as well as Anne, Kathy, and the rest of the Duclos friends and family. I encourage all of you to leave some love for all of them in the comments section. I love it when you guys are super kind to the people I talk about in these stories. And if you're interested in learning more about this story, first, I've linked an archive of articles by Cindy Hill, who covered this story in way more detail than I did at the time. And second, I've linked to the book Desperate Steps by Peter Kick, which includes a fantastic segment on Levi's tragic story. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click. And thank you for just being the best audience on YouTube. I'm so grateful for you guys, and I'll see all of you in the next video.